sperm or egg, essentially. What happens, how fast they grow, when they mature. In the ovarian cycle, there's a follicular phase. I drew it on the board when we talked about how when we're inside of the ovary, we have all the little thousands of oogonia all around the outside of our ovary. And our egg, if we could zoom in, our egg cell is actually inside of this follicle. And so as the follicle grows, the egg grows as well. So there's a follicular phase where FSH promotes the development of one of those follicles. There are other hormones at play that we don't have to memorize here, but FSH basically stimulates one of those follicles, either in the left or right ovary, sometimes both, depending on the person. And the follicle, as it grows, begins to secrete estrogen, more than usual. And so that causes some physiological changes in the body, both in the brain and in other organs. The body begins to prepare to become pregnant. Even if that is not your individual goal, that's what your body's trying to do at that point. After the follicle grows to a certain stage, you enter a luteal phase, which is the development of the corpus luteum. So after ovulation, this follicle sticks around and becomes an organ that releases hormones. And the hormone it releases is progesterone, the other sex hormone, which also causes even more physiological changes. It's a negative feedback loop because when you increase levels of progesterone and estrogen, your brain stops secreting FSH and LH. It thinks either you're prepared to be pregnant or you are. That's why a lot of common birth controls are just hormones, are just various forms of estrogen or progesterone. You're tricking your brain. It thinks that you have high levels of that hormone, so it doesn't produce LH and FSH. So it never stimulates the development of a follicle. Now, every so often, depending on what birth control you're on, either after a month or after 3 months, you'll take those sugar pills or you go off a month. That's so you can go through a cycle, or we can begin this. You don't want to just stick with high levels of progesterone all the time. We can only trick our brains for so long. And there's a lot more to that. That's kind of the simplest definition there, but it's kind of neat. Thank you, everybody. How we can sort of trick our systems. The uterine cycle, the uterus as an organ changes structure with the change in these hormones. The sex hormones that are produced during the ovarian cycle, progesterone and estrogen, stimulate changes in the uterus. And so the lining of the uterus, which we call the endometrium, and that's an important vocab word, endometrium is the lining of the uterus, thickens, vascularizes, which means blood vessels go to it to provide it nutrients, and begins to secrete a sticky mucus layer. It's in preparation to receive a fertilized egg, regardless of whether the egg is going to be fertilized or not. It doesn't wait for that. It prepares ahead of time. The ovaries produce estrogen at the beginning of the cycle, which encourages the endometrium to grow and prepare to receive a fertilized egg, even if it never actually receives a fertilized egg. This happens. It would be nice if it just waited to see, and you wouldn't have to deal with this every month. However, that's not how it works. It needs to prepare because you don't want to take the chance of that egg being fertilized, if that is your goal, and the uterus not being prepared when the egg gets there. And so it's a doomsday prepper, basically. It just prepares for the worst, prepares for if it's going to happen, whether it does or not. After ovulation, the egg itself releases progesterone. So it starts saying, hey, I'm on my way. And so it starts releasing progesterone. That signals the endometrium to thicken even more, provide more nutrients, vascularize, say, hey, I'm moving down that oviduct. I'm going to be there soon. If the egg is not fertilized, let's talk about that first. If the egg is not fertilized, we're talking, the size of that cell is in the micrometers. So it would probably just disintegrate or be absorbed. We would never even notice it if it's not fertilized. Probably it happens in the oviduct usually, it just kind of just disintegrates and we recycle the materials. That means we no longer produce progesterone. And then this corpus luteum, this yellow body that's also producing progesterone, disintegrates as well. And that means we're not producing those estrogens and progesterones in the ovary. So your body thinks, oh, okay, we don't have a fertilized egg. So all those signals stop. You stop secreting those secretions, you devascularize, and so that thickened endometrium, all of those cells begin to die. They die back to a thinner layer. When those cells die, the uterus is up inside the pelvic cavity. You don't want those cells to stay inside of you. It's a layer of skin, essentially, like skin-like tissue, epithelial tissue. You want to get that out. So that's when your body goes through and it causes all kinds of contractions, it releases all kinds of hormones to get that out in a process we call menstruation. And then it cleans itself out, it's fresh and new, ready to begin the next cycle, like a phoenix rising from the ashes. Shed it, and then you're on to the next cycle. It's a never-ending. The book says 28-day cycle. Most people in this room understand that that depends on the person, right? It doesn't have, some people are 2-month cycles, some people are in a 40-day cycle, some people are in a shorter cycle. So when we say these days, we're kind of on an average here. We know we talked about last chapter, everybody's different. And so it really just depends here, but these are on average, but you still need to know them. We're gonna memorize it based on a 28-day cycle because that fits for most people. This used to be an essay exam. It's no longer an essay exam, but you still have to know it. That's why it says must know for the exam at the top. Days 1 through 5 of the uterine cycle, we're kind of at the end. The egg wasn't fertilized, we're stopping here. And so endometrium disintegrates and devascularizes. We pull back those vessels. And that tissue and blood that's being released, we call menses. And so in menses, or someone is in menses, is kind of an older way of saying menstruation. It has to actually pass out during that cycle or leave the body. It's in a periodic cycle. And so sometimes people say period is the common conversational term for this. Day 6 starts over. FSH and LH says, all right, we didn't get pregnant, we better do it again. And so it stimulates the development of a follicle and the development of an egg growing. And so you start secreting estrogen and progesterone again, or estrogens really in the beginning. The endometrium thickens. Day 14, the big one, if there was an oocyte inside of a little oocyte inside of the follicle, it would be next to the side here. We'd actually release in ovulation. Whoops, what am I trying to do there? And so now we would have two things. If ovulation occurred, the egg would be secreting its own estrogens, and the corpus luteum would remain and be secreting high levels of progesterone at the same time. So now your body thinks that's on its way. So the endometrium thickens even more, doubles in thickness, begins to secrete a mucus-like layer, a sticky, nutrient-filled secretion. There are glands all in the uterus that begin to produce these chemicals. Because this oocyte, even when it's fertilized, even if it's a zygote that's gone through 2, 4, 6, 8 rounds of mitosis, that's still a microscopic cell. It's still ridiculously tiny. So by the time it gets to the uterus, the reason that layer is everywhere is you want to catch it wherever you can. Wherever it ends up, whichever side it comes out of, whichever ovary we're talking about here, the uterus wants to grab onto it. So that's why we have so much. I like this picture a lot. It's what I used to study, or a very similar picture that I used to study when I was first learning this. It shows what's going on in the brain. So it shows production of FSH and LH. It shows what's happening inside the ovary. Down here we have our days. It shows what's happening with the hormone production of estrogen and progesterone, and it shows what's happening to the endometrial lining. So it kind of puts it all together here for you, so you can study step by step what's happening, because you'll need to know, you'll need to be able to recall what's happening based on a multiple choice question. And so here, when we have these high levels of progesterone and estrogen, the body thinks or assumes that you're either pregnant or you're going to be. And so we discussed how that's why you can take progesterones or estrogens in different versions and trick the body into not putting out FSH and LH. So you don't go through ovulation, or at least you don't go through in such the extreme amounts. Menstruation itself involves a lot of different processes. At that point, when you're not getting the estrogen progesterone signals, there are a couple other hormones that you're not producing. And so the arteries that are supplying nutrients, supplying oxygen to those tissues, weaken and begin to die back. If there's any tissue in your body not getting oxygen, not getting blood flow, it's going to die. And so this is true with the endometrial lining. When that dies back, that thickened layer you created dies back. The layers of that lining begin to detach. We use the word sloughing off when we talk about skin or something. It's kind of a gross word, but that's what's happening. It's actually pulling apart. That all of that mucus, as well as the blood that's remaining from those capillaries, begins to leave the body. You also produce a special hormone called fibrinolysin. Fibrinolysin. Fibrin is a substance produced that helps you clot. It's like it makes a little network inside of your blood, so it helps clots and scabs and things form. You don't want that at this point. You want all of that material out. You don't want any blood clots to form. It's going to happen. Blood clots form just because that's what blood does, but you're trying to stop that. So fibrinolysin is an enzyme released from those dying cells that tries to stop the blood from clotting. Because remember, that's in the pelvic cavity. You do not want that to hang out in there. It does happen to some people, but you do not, that's not part of it. But along with this also comes some pain. By some, I mean some folks experience an extreme amount of pain. It really depends on the person, obviously. But your body also goes through involuntary, which means you're not controlling it really, contractions to get that out. And so I'm doing this to show contractions, but the muscles actually tighten and go through a wave-like process to try to get those out, to get that material out. There's hope at the end of the tunnel, I guess, light at the end of the tunnel. Menopause can occur later in life. Could start at 45, could start at 55, could start at 65. Everybody's different. But this is the process when menstruation no longer occurs. Unfortunately, it's not like flipping a switch. This happens in stages. What's happening is either your ovaries are no longer functioning, there are no longer as many eggs as there used to be, so sometimes some months you don't have any eggs, and so your hormone levels that you were used to kind of start to waver. Maybe you'll have some progesterone some months, maybe you won't. You know, maybe there'll be a bunch of progesterone, maybe there won't. And so along with that comes a lot of other symptoms. And unfortunately, this doesn't happen overnight. This could be a decade-long process. But after that decade, you're done menstruating. So I guess there is some hope at the end. However, it's just, we've all heard these stories, right? Sometimes you can get hot flashes, you get chills, there are mood swings associated with this. Sometimes there's pain. It's just, there's all kinds of stuff that occurs with menopause. But that's actually the process of basically the ovaries not functioning like they used to.